What if I told you that some people believe holding hands with someone outside of their relationship is worse than sending a naked photo, and that others find an emotional affair far more painful than a physical one? It might sound surprising, but these gray areas are often what make or break relationships. As a urologist and pelvic surgeon, I spend much of my time helping people understand intimacy, trust, and connection, not just in a physical sense, but emotionally as well. And one thing I've learned is that people have very different definitions of what counts as cheating. We often assume that our partner sees the world through the same lens we do. We think, of course, they know that's inappropriate or that's obviously cheating. But the truth is, what feels like a betrayal to one person might seem harmless to another. These unspoken assumptions can quietly erode trust, leading to resentment and conflict that neither partner fully understands. It's not always about the act itself, it's about the meaning attached to it. When I talk to couples in clinic or on my platform, I often find that they've never actually sat down and discussed their boundaries. They might agree that having sex with someone else is cheating, most people do. But when it comes to behaviors like texting, sharing secrets, or grabbing dinner with someone of the opposite sex, things get complicated. Those gray zones are where most misunderstandings happen. And it's precisely why understanding what you and your partner each define as cheating is so critical to building a healthy, trusting relationship. Before we dive deeper, it's worth pausing to consider why these differences matter so much. Infidelity, emotional, physical, or otherwise, isn't just about the act of being unfaithful. It's about how it affects our sense of safety, our emotional security, and our confidence in the relationship. When one partner feels betrayed and the other feels unfairly accused, it creates a gap that can be hard to bridge. That's why researchers have become increasingly interested in understanding not just what people do when they cheat, but what people believe counts as cheating in the first place. To explore this, a team from the University of Michigan conducted a fascinating study that I think offers some real insight. They surveyed 456 college students, most around 19 years old, and about two-thirds women, and asked them to rate 27 different behaviors on whether they counted as cheating in a long-term relationship. These behaviors range from the obvious, like sexual intercourse or oral sex, to the more ambiguous, such as holding hands, going on a road trip, or sharing personal secrets. The researchers grouped these behaviors into categories: sexual behaviors, erotic interactions, emotional bonding, financial support, and social interactions. Then they asked participants to rate each behavior on a scale from 0 to 100. 0 meaning definitely not cheating, and 100 meaning definitely cheating. Now, this study didn't just stop at behaviors. The researchers also looked at two psychological traits that deeply influence how people view relationships: attachment anxiety and attachment avoidance. These terms come from attachment theory, a framework psychologists use to describe how we form and maintain emotional bonds with others. People with high attachment anxiety often fear abandonment. They crave closeness and reassurance, but they're also hyper-aware of potential threats to their relationship. They might interpret even small interactions between their partner and another person as signs of disloyalty. On the other hand, people with high attachment avoidance tend to distance themselves emotionally. They value independence and can sometimes downplay or dismiss intimacy. These differences in attachment style can dramatically shape how we interpret our partner's actions and what we consider a betrayal. For example, someone who is anxious about being abandoned might feel devastated if their partner shares personal secrets with someone else or gives emotional support to another person. Meanwhile, someone more avoidant might not see that as an issue at all and could even engage in those same behaviors without realizing how hurtful they appear. You can see how this mismatch can quickly lead to misunderstandings, even when both people genuinely care about each other. When we examine human relationships through this lens, it becomes clear that cheating isn't a single act. It's a perception influenced by our past experiences, fears, and emotional wiring. A brief hug or a text message can carry completely different meanings depending on who's observing it. One person might see it as a harmless gesture of friendship. Another might view it as an act of betrayal. What's most intriguing about the University of Michigan study is how strongly these personal factors shape our moral compass around fidelity. For example, nearly everyone agreed that sexual behaviors like intercourse or oral sex clearly qualify as cheating, but beyond that, opinions varied wildly. Erotic behaviors like sexting or sending nude photos were rated as cheating by most participants, but not all. Emotional acts like forming deep bonds or sharing secrets fell somewhere in the middle, revealing a huge range of personal interpretation. These findings highlight something I often remind patients and viewers. Human relationships are built on both emotion and perception. What we think of as cheating isn't defined by a universal rule. It's shaped by our personal experiences, attachment style, and expectations. So why does this matter for you and your relationships? Because unspoken boundaries can quietly damage trust. You might believe your relationship is solid until something seemingly minor sparks a major argument. Understanding that not everyone defines betrayal the same way is the first step toward building a healthier, more transparent connection. In the next chapter, we'll dive deeper into the science of how gender and attachment style influence what people perceive as cheating, and why our brains respond to different forms of infidelity in such unique ways. Understanding this can help you not only prevent relationship conflict, but also develop greater empathy for your partner's emotional triggers. After all, a strong relationship isn't just about avoiding betrayal, it's about understanding each other deeply enough to prevent it. When it comes to defining infidelity, the lines that separate acceptable from unacceptable behavior are rarely straight. They're often blurred by context, emotion, and personal experience. What's fascinating, though, is how predictable those gray areas can actually be once we start looking at the science behind them. In the University of Michigan study, the results revealed not only how people classify different types of behavior as cheating, but also how personality, gender, and attachment style shape those judgments in surprisingly complex ways. Let's start with what almost everyone agrees on: sexual behaviors. Acts like intercourse, oral sex, or showering together were rated by 96 to 98% of participants as clear, undeniable cheating. This tells us something fundamental about human relationships. Sexual exclusivity still remains one of the strongest markers of commitment in most people's minds. When that boundary is crossed, it strikes directly at the heart of emotional security and trust. But things start to shift when we look at erotic behaviors that don't necessarily involve physical touch. Actions such as sexting, sending naked photos, or watching pornography with someone else were still considered cheating by a large majority, but the agreement wasn't universal. Scores ranged between 75 and 88%. What's interesting is that while people often rationalize these as harmless, digital interactions, the emotional weight they carry can be immense. For many, these behaviors feel like a profound violation of intimacy, even if no physical contact occurs. Now, here's where the study took an unexpected turn. Contrary to long-standing evolutionary psychology theories, women actually rated sexual and erotic behaviors as more indicative of cheating than men did. Traditionally, it's been assumed that men are more distressed by sexual infidelity, while women are more affected by emotional betrayal. Yet, this data painted a more nuanced picture. Women not only rated sexual acts as cheating more strongly, but they also rated emotional and relational behaviors like holding hands, texting intimate messages, or sharing secrets higher than men did. This challenges some of the old assumptions about gender infidelity. It suggests that women may hold a broader, more integrated view of commitment, one that encompasses both emotional and physical exclusivity, whereas men may draw the boundary more narrowly around physical acts. However, there was one surprising exception: men were more likely than women to consider giving someone money, even as little as $5, as a form of cheating. It's a curious finding, but it may speak to how men sometimes view financial generosity as a symbol of care or protection, something they associate with their role in a relationship. Beyond gender, the role of attachment style provided some of the most illuminating insights. Participants with high attachment anxiety, those who constantly fear losing their partner, rated 18 out of 27 behaviors as cheating. They saw risk in many ordinary social interactions because they were hypervigilant to potential signs of emotional or physical drift. It's not that these individuals are jealous. In the stereotypical sense, it's that their nervous system is wired to detect threats to closeness. To them, a dinner with a colleague, a long hug, or an inside joke with someone else can feel deeply unsettling. In contrast, participants with high attachment avoidance, those who prefer emotional distance, tended to rate those same behaviors as less indicative of cheating. They were less likely to see minor flirtations, physical closeness, or emotional sharing as problematic. This makes sense when you think about it. People who are uncomfortable with intimacy often view such behaviors as benign because they're not as emotionally invested in them. Interestingly, they might even engage in them themselves, not out of malice, but because they don't register the same emotional risk that a more anxious partner would. What this tells us is that perception of infidelity isn't just about moral values or cultural upbringing. It's deeply psychological. It reflects how secure or threatened we feel in our attachment bond. For those with secure attachment, the world feels stable. They can interpret a partner's actions in context and trust that occasional closeness with others doesn't threaten the relationship. But for those with anxious or avoidant patterns, even small gestures can be magnified into symbols of danger or distance. The study also revealed something researchers call the signal strength effect. Essentially, the more intense or intimate a behavior seemed, the more likely participants would label it as cheating. For instance, kissing on the lips was seen as far more serious than a quick kiss on the cheek. Giving someone 500 carried much greater weight than lending 5, and hugging for more than 10 seconds was judged as more intimate, and therefore more suspect than a brief friendly hug. Sleeping in the same bed with someone, even without physical contact, was rated far higher on the cheating scale than merely staying in the same hotel room. These distinctions may seem subtle, but they underscore how our brains use context and intensity to evaluate emotional threat. From a psychological standpoint, this makes perfect sense. Human beings are wired to pick up on signals of romantic or sexual intent. When a gesture crosses a certain emotional threshold, like prolonged eye contact, a private message, or a slow, lingering hug, it activates areas of the brain associated with attachment and threat detection. It's the same neural circuitry that evolved to help us maintain pair bonds and detect potential rivals. While modern relationships are far more complex than our evolutionary past, those ancient instincts are still very much alive in our emotional responses. When researchers analyzed all their data, they found that the 27 behaviors clustered neatly into 3 broad categories. The first was sexual and erotic interactions, which were rated around 93% on the cheating scale. These included intercourse, sexting, and other explicitly intimate acts. The second category, close relationship behaviors, hovered around 42% and included holding hands, sharing secrets, or providing small amounts of financial help. This was the murky middle ground where most disagreements occur. The final category, casual social interactions, like brief hugs or discussing work problems, was rated at only 11%, behaviors most people agreed were innocent. If you've ever argued with your partner over something that seemed trivial to you but deeply upsetting to them, you're not alone. What this research shows is that those arguments aren't really about the behavior itself. They're about perception, attachment, and emotional history. To someone with anxious attachment, a coffee with a friend might feel like a doorway to betrayal. To someone more avoidant, it might just be casual conversation. Both perspectives are real and valid from the inside, but they clash when partners fail to recognize or talk about their differences. In clinical practice, I often see how these dynamics play out over time. A couple might come in because one partner feels emotionally neglected, while the other feels accused of something they never intended. When we unpack their story, what emerges isn't malice, it's miscommunication. The key isn't to label one person as overreacting and the other as insensitive, but to understand how their attachment styles interact. Relationships thrive when both partners can recognize these patterns and build empathy around them. Understanding the science behind how people define cheating can empower us to navigate our relationships more wisely. It invites compassion for our partner's reactions, even when they seem irrational. It helps us recognize that our definitions of loyalty are shaped by much more than logic. They're tied to the very core of how we form emotional safety. In the next and final chapter, we'll talk about what this means for real-world relationships, how to have those difficult but essential conversations about boundaries, how to recognize your own attachment style, and how to strengthen trust in a world full of gray areas. Because while science can explain why we disagree about cheating, it's empathy, communication, and self-awareness that ultimately decide whether our relationships survive it. Understanding what people consider cheating is fascinating, but knowing how to apply that understanding to real relationships is where it truly matters. After all, a relationship doesn't thrive on assumptions. It thrives on communication, trust, and emotional safety. And when it comes to infidelity, whether physical, emotional, or even digital, what hurts most isn't always the act itself. It's the breach of shared understanding. That's why it's so essential to talk about these gray areas before they turn into painful misunderstandings. The first and most important step is conversation. Too often, couples assume that their partner sees cheating exactly the same way they do. They believe the boundaries are obvious, when in reality, those boundaries are often shaped by personality, upbringing, and past experiences. For one person, grabbing coffee with a friend from work may be completely innocent. For another, it may feel like emotional intimacy that should belong exclusively to their partner. The key is to discuss these differences before they become conflicts. Ask questions like, what kinds of behaviors would make you uncomfortable if I did them with someone else? Or, what feels like crossing a line for you? These may sound like awkward conversations, but they are some of the most meaningful ones you can have as a couple. The study we explored earlier found that participants' perceptions of cheating ranged anywhere from 9% to 98%, depending on the behavior. That wide variation alone shows that there's no universal rulebook for fidelity. A brief hug, a friendly text, or an after-work dinner might mean something very different depending on the relationship dynamics and the emotional history between partners. When we fail to clarify those meanings, we leave our relationships open to misunderstanding. But when we set shared expectations, we create an invisible safety net, one that allows both partners to relax, feel secure, and focus on connection rather than suspicion. It's also important to understand your own attachment style and how it influences your reactions. If you often find yourself feeling anxious about your partner's friendships or interactions, it doesn't necessarily mean you're too controlling or insecure. It might mean you have higher attachment anxiety, which makes you hyper aware of potential threats to the relationship. Recognizing this pattern is not a weakness, it's a form of self-awareness. Once you know it, you can begin to communicate those fears from a place of vulnerability instead of accusation. Saying, when you spend a lot of time texting that person, I start to worry that I'm not enough, opens a very different kind of dialogue than saying, why are you always texting them? On the other hand, if you identify more with attachment avoidance, you may tend to downplay emotional closeness or find it uncomfortable when your partner seeks reassurance. You might think, it's not a big deal, we're just friends, while your partner feels increasingly disconnected. Recognizing that your natural tendency might be to withdraw or minimize emotional cues can help you meet your partner halfway. Healthy relationships are about understanding that both partners' emotional responses are valid, even when they seem to come from opposite ends of the spectrum. When I work with couples navigating trust issues, I often remind them that context and signal strength matter enormously. A short hug at a family gathering is very different from a lingering embrace in private. A professional dinner to discuss a project is very different from a candlelit one on one meal with flirtatious undertones. These nuances may seem subtle, but they communicate vastly different emotional messages. The strength of the signal, how intimate, private, or emotionally charged the behavior feels, determines how threatening it appears to your partner. By becoming more mindful of those signals, we can prevent unintentional harm and show respect for the boundaries that make our partners feel safe. There's also a gender dimension that's worth acknowledging. In the study, women were generally more likely to rate a wider range of behaviors as cheating, not just emotional ones. This doesn't mean that women are more controlling or jealous. It may reflect how women, culturally and psychologically, often place a high value on emotional exclusivity and relational depth. For many women, emotional betrayal can feel just as painful, if not more, than physical infidelity. For men, while sexual betrayal may traditionally trigger stronger reactions, the emotional impact is still profound when trust is broken. In both cases, what hurts is the same: the feeling that someone else has entered a space that was meant to be shared only between two people. It's also worth remembering that this study focused primarily on young adults, college students around 19 years old. Older adults, married couples, or individuals from different cultural backgrounds may perceive cheating differently. In some cultures, certain forms of social closeness are normal. In others, they might be strictly off limits. Likewise, in long-term marriages, couples often develop unspoken understandings about what's acceptable based on mutual trust, experience, and shared history. This is why no study, no matter how large, can define what cheating means for you. Only open dialogue with your partner can do that. But beyond communication, there's something deeper at play: the act of building emotional resilience in a relationship. Even the strongest couples can face moments of doubt or insecurity. What separates those who recover from those who don't isn't perfection, it's repair. When boundaries are crossed, whether intentionally or not, addressing the hurt with honesty and empathy can rebuild trust more powerfully than pretending it didn't happen. Saying, I understand why that upset you, and I want to make sure it doesn't happen again, is far more healing than defensiveness or silence. Repair isn't about assigning blame, it's about reaffirming commitment. Finally, it's helpful to view cheating not as a rigid category, but as a continuum, a spectrum of behaviors ranging from harmless to deeply damaging. Where you and your partner draw the line will depend on your unique emotional landscape. What matters most is that both of you feel respected, valued, and emotionally secure. If either of you feels persistently anxious, unheard, or uncertain, it's worth exploring those feelings with compassion rather than judgment. Sometimes That exploration may include talking to a sex therapist or relationship counselor, especially if patterns of mistrust or miscommunication have taken root. At the end of the day, understanding what constitutes cheating isn't about creating a list of rules. It's about fostering awareness. It's about learning to navigate the emotional and psychological terrain of intimacy with empathy and intention. The more you understand your partner's fears, boundaries, and emotional needs, the stronger your bond becomes. So, as you think about your own relationship, take a moment to ask yourself, have we actually defined what fidelity means to us? Have you talked about what feels okay and what doesn't? Because love at its core isn't just about attraction, it's about understanding. And when you take the time to align your emotional definitions, you're not just preventing infidelity. You're building a foundation of trust that can weather the inevitable challenges of life together. And as I often tell my patients and viewers, take care of yourself first. Healthy relationships start with healthy individuals, people who are self-aware, grounded, and capable of both giving and receiving love. Because when you nurture yourself, you bring your best, most secure self into the relationship. And that, more than anything else, is the real secret to lasting trust and connection.